So, hello everyone, and welcome to this interview, which we have been invited to do by Patricia Seiner on behalf of the International Association of Patristic Studies for the Giving Thanks series. So, my name is Eric Crégheur, and I'm Professor of Early Christian History and Literature at Université Laval in Quebec City, Canada. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague, David Brakke of Ohio State University. Of course, David doesn't really need an introduction before this audience, but let me just say briefly a few words nonetheless. So David Brakke is the Joe R. Engel Chair in the History of Christianity and Professor of History at Ohio State University since 2012. David Brakke studies and teaches the history and literature of ancient Christianity, more or less from its origin through to the 5th century, with a special interest in asceticism, monasticism, Gnosticism, end quote, biblical interpretation, and Egyptian Christianity, and we'll probably have the opportunity to come back on all of these interests. He also published books on these topics, notably Demons and the Making of the Monk, Spiritual Combat in Early Christianity at Harvard University Press in 2006, The Gnostics, Myth, Ritual, and Diversity in Early Christianity, again at Harvard University Press in 2010, and a new translation with introduction and commentary on the Gospel of Judas at Yale University Press in 2022. And he also has edited and translated many early Christian texts, most recently with David Gwynn, the Festal Letters of Athanasius of Alexandria at Liverpool University Press, again in 2022. So thank you again, David. Thank you very much for accepting to do this interview.
Glad to be here.
Yes. So I'd like to start maybe with a broader question by asking you if you could tell us a bit about your general trajectory in academia. So how did you first become interested in studying in ancient Christianity, its literatures, the church fathers, and to eventually make it a career out of these interests?
Well, I followed a very circuitous route to get there. As an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, I was actually a major in English literature. And, you know, this was in the early 80s, and it was a time of lots of theoretical stuff happening in the study of literature and so on. And but then while I was an undergraduate and I was an English major, I took a class in the New Testament and was fascinated and was fortunate to study with the teacher of that class was a scholar there named Dan Vaya, who, if you're not in New Testament, you probably don't know, but he was a big pioneer in bringing in the literary study of the New Testament works. And by literary, I mean really like a literature professor, not literary like, you know, Bultmann did, you know, or whatever, right? And so anyway, so that brought together my interests, and I thought, well, you know, and you know, English, going to grad school in English in those days, it was like, oh, I'm just gonna have to read a lot of Derrida and you know, and so forth. So I decided to go to grad school, and I thought I was going to do New Testament. But I went to Harvard Div School, where people like Helmut Kester and Margaret Miles and people like that were really taking, you know, placing the New Testament in the wider history of ancient Christianity and very interested in non-canonical literature. And you know, at that time, Kester was very much working on the idea that all the gospel, you know, making a history of gospels that wasn't just canonical and was everything. So I kind of got pulled into that kind of thing. And so then when I went to get my PhD at Yale, I went into a program that was called Ancient Christianity and kind of was both New Testament and patristics together. And you had to take classes that were both New Testament kind of oriented things and more what we would call patristic oriented things. And it wasn't quite clear where I'd kind of end up doing things, but I ended up taking both I had Greek and Latin, but I ended up taking Coptic and Syriac, and I began, and I thought, oh, these languages are great, and I was kind of made to learn them, right? My advisor said, you must take these classes. And so I learned these languages, and I thought, well, now I have to find some way to use them. I can't just learn these things and not do anything. And it's while I was studying for my general exams that I learned that there were all these texts attributed to Athanasius that survived only in Coptic and Syriac. And I thought, well, goodness, I can work on him, and I can use Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. I can do all these things and so on. So it was kind of a long and winding road that took me from kind of studying English literature to studying the New Testament to really studying kind of the fathers or just early Christianity in general. And I will admit that part of what moved me from New Testament to, more patristics was, I loved the New Testament, but if you wanted to write something about, I don't know, the Gospel of Mark or the letter to the Romans, I mean, there were like 15 million things that people had written about this stuff. And it's like trying to find something new to say and be interesting was like, threading a needle, right? And then you go to patristics and they're like entire texts that people haven't even
edited or
Yes, yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, and there's there was so much more uncharted territory, and that was very exciting to me as opposed to trying to make my way on a path that, literally thousands upon thousands of scholars had trod before me. So it was kind of a long path, but there it is.
yeah. And is it through Athanasius that you develop more interest in asceticism and monasticism and all these other more Egyptian?
Yes. Well, you have to see that I entered my PhD program in 86. And so this is late 80s. And what was really cool right then, what everyone was like excited about was asceticism, the body, sexuality. So I think it was 87 maybe that Peter Brown published The Body and Society, maybe 89. It was late 80s, right when I was in grad school. I, didn't eat for a week so that I could buy the hardcover,
Already practicing
Yes, I
asceticism.
mean, yes, I was already doing that. So that was very cool. He was kind of putting a stamp of, you know, he legitimated studying these things in a way that, of course, because he was doing it. And there was at the time in the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature in this country, there was kind of the asceticism working group that was like Vincent Wimbush and Jim Goring and Elizabeth Clark and Virginia Burris, and all these people were working on asceticism. And so that was kind of cool. And when I looked at Athanasius, right, a lot of the stuff that that was interesting, but people had always said, oh, he wrote the Life of Antony and he's really into monasticism, but no one had really written about him taking into account the works attributed to him that were in Coptic and Syriac, because these were often things that were ascetic, like on virginity and so forth. And then there were the festal letters, of course, which kind of talk about how the ordinary Christian should practice certain ascetic virtues. And so it seemed like a good project. And it was also, what people were interested in at the time. And, that was kind of, it was what we were all talking about. And we were all reading, people like Foucault and so on, and thinking about the body and the history of sexuality. And so so it was a way for me to participate in those things. And also, and I mean, I found it interesting, obviously, but that's kind of in the context in which I started working on that stuff. And I was also very interested in doing something on Gnosticism, but my advisor at the time, Bentley Layton, was my doctoral advisor, and he had closed the book on Gnostic. When he finished the Gnostic scriptures and published his Nag Hammadi volumes, he was like, I am done. I'm moving on and not doing. And so he was not very excited to have students do Gnosticism projects. So, and he was getting into monasticism himself. So all these things kind of came together to kind of lead me into doing Athanasius and asceticism and monks, I think. Yeah.
And you finally, you at the end, you found a way to go back to Gnosticism.
I always knew I would
Yeah.
because you know I learned Coptic, and I remember reading and I learned it with Bentley, who's of course, you know, one of the great Coptologists ever. And we learned Coptic from photocopies of various drafts of what eventually became his two grammars. He has a learning grammar called Coptic in 20 Lessons, and then a Coptic grammar, the kind of big fat, you know, thing about Sahidic. And it's interesting because he at first, I think, didn't know which one he was doing. And so he ended up kind of doing both. But we got photocopies that were kind of blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I learned from that. And of course, we read a lot. We read Nag Hammadi stuff at some point, and those too we often read because we read from stuff that often had not yet been published. I mean, the you know process of publishing some of these, it took much, you know, people think, oh, I mean, compared to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it like came out like with lightning speed, but still it was not, you know, we read you know, 3 steles of Seth from photocopies, you know, of things. So anyway, that was a very exciting time, and it was cool to do that. And I kind of, you know, and I wrote wrote papers and seminar papers on this stuff. So I kind of always knew I'd go back to it. And yeah, so yeah, eventually I did. Yeah.
There are themes that intersect anyway with relationship with the body, and so things
Mm-hmm.
we find both in more classical patristic authors and also in Gnostic texts. So it's another voice on the same topic.
That's exactly right. And of course, and now, you know, nowadays, you know, a lot of voices in the world of Nag Hammadi studies, of course, think, you know, basically Nag Hammadi studies is monasticism
Yeah.
studies. So they've kind of really become intertwined, less so for me than for other people, but they've become kind of intertwined in a way that both in a historical sense, that is, that they're, you know, entwined historically. But yes, you're actually right in that also one of the things that was exciting about studying Gnosticism in those days was ideas about the body and gender, and what was the significance of all these, you know, female gendered beings and so forth. And that kind of went together with the study of asceticism and asceticism. But I will confess that one of the things, confess isn't the right word, it's not a problem, but one of the things that really brought those things together for me was the language, Coptic. That is, I really liked it, and I, you know, loved reading it. And so, and it was a fun, you know, I'll never forget reading Shenouda for the first time and going like, oh my God, you know, and having to figure out what the heck this person was saying. And, you know, it was so it also is a nice, you know, that language leads to these two things. And you see a lot of people who, like James Goring, for example, who made the same, who likewise both did Nag Hammadi stuff and monasticism too. Yeah.
And would you say even today that one doesn't really belong without the other, or is it necessary? How relevant is the study of Gnosticism for patristic in your view, in your
Well,
opinion?
I think for patristics, it's very, I think it is very important because clearly it's the, I don't know, we used to talk about the 2nd century crisis of Gnosticism and so forth, but you know, that's, and now we kind of think, oh, you know, blah, 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 but it's real. You know? I mean, you know, Irenaeus wrote is that giant thing. And if we, you know, so it's, I think it's still, you know, it's very important. And I think we still, um, it's still a problem, I think, of how precisely to integrate the non-commodity stuff into the wider field of patristics, mainly because non-commodity as a concept, right, or as a collection or as a thing is kind of such a, I don't know, it's such a brand name. People think of it as its own thing over here rather than a set of manuscripts. Yeah.
No, I agree. I agree with you on this question. We have like Nagamadi scholars and other scholars, and everything should be put back together in the broader, wider context.
Yeah, I mean, but it's, you know, it's, I mean, what happens, of course, is that as a field develops, and patristics has really, you know, I mean, I'd say the last 100 years or so, right, have been a massive step forward in the world of patristics, right? But what often happens then is a kind of increasing specialization and a explosion of information that it's very difficult for the single scholar to master, you know? And I mean, I look at, for example, my graduate education. It was fine for me to just take that time and learn all those languages. It's becoming more difficult for students to do that because of the way funding goes and you know, I had no pressure when I was a graduate student to like publish papers in journals. I mean, it was like, no, just learn your languages and, you know, so forth. So it's just, yeah, it's hard to master all these things so that you feel comfortable in all of them. So that's a big thing to try to overcome. Yeah.
And maybe going back to Coptic a little bit more, we often think of Coptic as this on this language in which Greek texts were translated, or just like a translation language. But of course, there are some original Coptic writers and texts. What can you say about how Coptic authors, what they can add to our knowledge of early Christian literature, or early Christianity, not necessarily Egyptian, but in the broader context, maybe of Christianity and the way it developed in the Mediterranean world.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you think about people who actually wrote in Coptic, right? In our period, let's say before the Muslim conquest, let's say, the vast majority are monks, right? And so I think what they add really is a kind of, they expand a sense of what kind of literature monasticism produces and uses. I mean, I think the kind of categories that we use, I'm going to say we, that is historians of monasticism. I'm going to say, you know, historians of monasticism. So if you have a if you say we're going to have a conference on monasticism, and you got everyone together who does Christian monasticism, I think most of our categories of genres and what we think monastic literature is definitely based first on Latin, right? We look at Benedict's rule, and we look at kind of Latin models, and then maybe we start to bring in some Byzantine and Greek Eastern material, you know, and you can see people who've been trained with the rule is Benedict's rule, and then they go look at like Basil, and they're like, what is this? You know, so, and Basil's a classic author. But then, you know, you look at the works of Shenouda or what Pachomius and his followers produced, and they're not quite the same. And I think they kind of show us that the parameters or the kinds of things that monastic communities, you know, used and produced is that the kind of categories and ways we think about have been built on a certain narrow base. And the same can be said not just about Coptic, but about Syriac. That is, that only recently have people begun to really integrate Syriac, what we know about Syriac texts and genres and so forth, into their understanding of what monks, did. So, so I think it just kind of expands and in some ways undermines kind of our notion of what the monastic genres are in some ways. So, yeah.
So would you say that we are taking more and more into account these voices today? We need to do so, of course.
Yes, I would say we are, and it's both a function of more and more, especially scholars who are younger than me, you know, doing this stuff and bringing this stuff into the conversation. But it's also, I mean, at least here in the United States, there is a feeling among academics, both students and faculty and people around, that we need to be, the catchword is more global in our way of thinking about things. And I think there's a real desire among many teachers and their students to look beyond, say, Western Europe and oh yay, Greece too, right? As what Christianity, classic Christianity is or was or whatever. And so I think there's an increased interest in a kind of bigger picture and in seeing the fact that Christianity from the get-go was not necessarily simply a Greek or Roman or Latin phenomenon. So I think this is all good and very salutary. So yes.
And do you think we can see the same, if we speak in the broader sense of patristic studies, that we can see the same tendency to widen or have a broader approach to the subject that texts the authors?
I think so. I mean, the one fun thing, one of my many fun things about patristic studies right now, of course, is how diverse it is, right? And you still have, I mean, you know, we just have a lot of different people reading this literature with a lot of different methodologies and interests, right? And a lot of those different methodologies and interests are shaped by the context in which you work and teach and so forth. And so what it's a big deal for me that I spent, the first half of my teaching career in a religious studies department, right? And always in a state university. I've been in a state-supported non-religious institution. And now for the last 11 years, I've been in a history department. And those kinds of contexts encourage one to, especially the history, I must say, to think in bigger and wider terms, right? And at least in the US, more and more institutions are looking for faculty who do, well, essentially pre-modernity in Europe and West Asia, North Africa, and so on. And so they're looking for much broader kind of stuff than looking closely at how, I don't know, Gregory of Nyssa used, the Parmenides or something. We have to look at a kind of bigger picture to be relevant and to speak to the context in which we find ourselves.
Great. Going back maybe to your career in a broader sense, what would you say would be your most decisive contribution to the field of patristics? Is there something, a book or a particular conference paper that you are more proud of, or you think made an impact, or something that you're
Well, it's kind of interesting because now in this, technological age, one can do a certain amount of self web surfing, and you can go on something like Google Scholar and see what is it that people cite the most, and what do they read the most. And it doesn't seem to appear that when I look at my statistics, I mean, I get a lot of citations of that Gnostics book, but I think almost everyone who even touches the topic feels the need to put it in a footnote, right? They list me and Michael Williams, and they list a bunch of things. So I'm not sure exactly. Yes. So what's fascinating to me is it's really my work on demons that seems to be the thing. I mean, it's and I'm not sure whether this is the field of patristics, because we're used to demons, or we should be. We should be like, oh yes, demons, of course. But in the wider world, people sometimes forget that there are these things called demons. And I wrote the book on the demons, and I did, by far my most popular book in terms of sales and so forth is my translation of Evagrius's Anti-Hereticus, which, talking back, it's a thin little book, and it's just huge. People just buy it. And and I think it just the demons and the sins and anxieties and fears that they are involved with and that they represent and so forth are compelling topics for people. And so, I was on the kind of tail end of the whole body and sex and asceticism thing. And, when I started getting it back into Gnosticism became uncool for a long time. It's kind of back, right? There was a period where people weren't really doing it, right? It was very not big. But I do think I was kind of like one of the, I was kind of a pioneer in demons. So I think if I've done anything, I think what will last longest from what I've done are my translations. I mean, I've done a lot of translating, and people will be, reading Athanasius Vestal letters for, a long time. But I think in terms of like substantive stuff, demons seem to be the thing.
A universal preoccupation.
It is, and it's better than, I mean, just to some of you, this is ancient history, but my first, I wrote a couple articles very early in my career, but my most famous early article and the first paper I gave at North American Patristic Society was on nocturnal emissions. That gets cited all the time. And for a while, this is how people knew me. They were like, oh, you're the guy who wrote that thing. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess so. But I've written other things. I have done other stuff. So, yeah, you never know what's going to end up being a big deal. And I certainly did not anticipate that the demons would become the thing. And I'm often asked to speak about them and, so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, catches the imagination.
Yes, and now a lot of people, there's been a lot more and better work on demons since I wrote my book. So that's a good thing.
So, of course, this interview is like I said at the beginning, is part of the Giving Thanks series of the International Association of Patristic Studies. So, can I ask you a couple of questions about your involvement with the IAPS? So, how did your participation in the association start? When did you first become a member of?
Well, I first learned about the group through going to the Oxford Patristics Conference, and I met. That's a great place where you meet people, for those of us who are from North America, where you really meet, lots of European scholars and scholars from, I regret to say that the interchange between North and South America has not traditionally been great. So you meet those scholars as well. And so that's where I first learned about the organization and that it exists and everything. And I had also I guess it was late 90s, maybe early 2000s, had started to participate in several workshops and things organized by colleagues in the Nordic countries. So that's, I met Anders Christian Jakobsen, who's, a very important figure in the association, Samuel Rubinson, people like that. And so I learned about the organization. I thought, well, yeah, I should join this if they'll have me. And then, so I joined, and then I became the council delegate from, as it's called, from the United States. So that helped me to learn more about what the association did. But I'll tell you, the thing that just like captured me and made me like, oh, I'm so glad I'm part of this group, is the bulletin, which comes out every year. And though now it's in PDF, which is wonderful. But it lists all these. I'm terrible because I never send in what I have done because I'm kind of lazy. I'm bad on things like this, but I'm very grateful other people do it. And because it's this treasure trove of information about what people are doing. And, for 10 years, I was editor of the Journal of Early Christian Studies. And I was constantly looking for people to read manuscripts. So how
You
do you
browse
find
through the
exactly? So you're like, oh, I have this paper on, Marcellus of Ancyra, and I'm like, who works on that? The AI, the Association of International Association of Patristic Studies is going to help me find that, right? So it's a network of people that enable you to know more about what's going on and to transcend your local area and hook up with others. And that's been really important to me. And it's what attracted me to the group and has kept me as a member.
And can you say that your involvement with the association has ever impacted your research, maybe by meeting scholars that have influenced you in some
Most
topics?
definitely, right. Yeah. And it's enabled me. I mean, we don't really, the association doesn't really get together that much. I mean, we're not like, all in a room that frequently, but because of the network that it creates, I have been able to reach out to people and say, hey, I see you've been working on X. I'm also thinking about X, what's going on. And so it really has facilitated communication and interaction in a way that, well, it would have impoverished my research if I didn't have that kind of connection. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't always show up in footnotes and stuff, but it's the kind of intellectual stimulation and so on that enhances.
After, yeah,
Right. Yeah.
discussing papers afterward.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. So I'm always happy to connect with people, which mostly happens in Oxford, when I see people from the association.
And speaking of the Oxford conference, I think a lot of our audience who has probably experienced the patristic conference in Oxford maybe would be interested if you could share with us some of your memories of conferences, or maybe when you first started attending, and is there something that
Yeah, well, I
particularly...
vividly remember my first one, which was in 1995, was the first one I went to. And I was, I had my PhD and I went, and I just cannot tell you how hot it was. It was so hot. And they had no rain. So like all the grass was brown. So these are not going to be edifying memories at first. I'll come up with edifying ones. But I was staying at, I think it was Trinity College. It's the one that's right by Blackwell's bookstore. But anyway, I was in the attic. I mean, the highest level with little just dormer windows. And oh, it was hot up there. And the bathrooms were in the basement. So I had to go down 5 flights of stairs and go 5 up. It was all very charming, of course, being Oxford, but it was like, oh my gosh. But my more my more edifying memories are of being able to meet people who, and this is 1995, so email was just kind of starting. I mean, it was very rudimentary and not used much by many people. And so these were a lot of scholars that I had, there were scholars I had carry on correspondence with. And I would suppose the one that I met at that first one, who became like my Oxford conference buddy for the next several Oxfords, was Timothy Barnes, of all people, who is, well, he's a character that we all love, right? And fear at the same time. But anyway, so he and I just struck up, and what was so great was that you would, in those days, you ate all your meals in your college. This was not ideal, but it was ideal in one sense. That is that you were always eating potentially with people you had never met before. And so I just met all these great people, and it was, I mean, it was really a formative experience for me. So the first couple times I gave communications, and I got great feedback on what I gave. And then there have been the last couple times I've been in workshops, and those have been really great as well. So they have just been, really important meetings, and I think mostly so that I can talk to people that I would not otherwise get the opportunity to talk to. So yeah, it's been great. But I'll never forget meeting Tim Barnes, because we had, so one of my first articles, not about nocturnal emissions, was about the life of Antony, because Barnes and this wonderful French scholar named René de Grey, maybe he was actually Belgian, I don't know, but anyway, they had argued that the Syriac life of Antony was a translation of an earlier form of the life of Antony than the one we know in Greek. And they were arguing that, oh, it has Copticisms in it, and blah, 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 and all this was just wrong. So I wrote this article saying all of this is wrong, and I actually had sent it to Timothy Barnes, because he had written this article saying this. And once Timothy Barnes writes an article like that in Journal of Theological Studies, which he did, everyone starts to think this must be true, right? Which it's not. So I sent him this article and said, really, Professor Barnes, I admire you so, but, blah, blah, blah. And he wrote back to me the kindest note with a little drawing of a flag. And he said, this is the white flag of surrender, which is, he's great. So anyway, so when I met him, I think he was just like, oh, you're the one. And so, anyway, it's a very pleasant memory for me. But I'm afraid it's not one of sitting in a great lecture or paper or something of that kind. But, there you go.
Of course, the Patristic Conference welcomes many younger scholars, like you were once, and
yes,
including myself in this. And so, do you have what advice would you give a new generation of scholars in patristic studies for the future? Would you have something to?
Oh, I have lots of advice, but it's all too much is the problem. But anyway, one of my teachers said to me, Rowan Greer, he said to me, David, the best training for patristic scholar is studying the New Testament. And that's probably true. And so, I would say, be sure that part of your background at some point, maybe as an undergraduate, who knows, is that you take at least a couple courses where you do deep, you do exegesis of New Testament texts, because this is what they're all reading the New Testament. Well, or at least the books that ended up in the New Testament, right? These fathers that we study. And so the more you know about these texts, the better, I would say, so that you can see them. Of course, same goes for the Septuagint as well, but that's just, too much. And my other bit of advice is, if you think you want to know languages that are not Greek and Latin, like Syriac or Coptic or Ethiopic or so forth, learn them then when you're young, because by the time you later in life, there's just too much happening. So, and that there's something to be said if you have if there's an hour in the day and your choice is between reading some, latest interesting theoretical perspective or like reading some Greek, read the Greek. I mean, and this comes from someone who's like totally into reading all this other stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's the young period when one is a graduate student and a kind of starting out faculty member is, the crucial time to get all that stuff that you're going to need for the long haul. And because it only gets busier, if you end up being a professor, or something like that, they're going to make you go to committee meetings where you talk about, the electrical wiring in the, seminar room and stuff like that. And, it doesn't get any better. So that's my advice.
Great advice. To start with a good base, a good
Yes,
foundation.
read the New Testament and learn the
Learn the
languages you
language.
think you will want to know. And because, if I regret anything, like right now when I sit down and go, oh, I wish I had learned Arabic.
Yeah.
But, and I'm not gonna, I started regretting not knowing Arabic when I was around 30 or 35, but already that ship had sailed. There's no way I was learning Arabic. So, there you go. So that's what I would recommend. I'm a big fan of languages.
Okay, I understand. I am too. So before we wrap things up, what's up ahead for you and the research?
Yeah. So I am working on two things at the moment. One is a kind of bigger project, which is a book that in simple terms is about the formation of the New Testament, but that's not quite what it is. I'm trying to write a book about what I call kind of scriptural practices, the various ways that Christians treated Christian literature as authoritative. And I do believe that there's a kind of significant shift in that in the 4th century when they start making lists of the New Testament. So I'm kind of telling that story of how we get to the making of lists of the New Testament. But rather than stopping there, I'm kind of wanting to go forward into how that changed the way early Christians thought about authorship and literature in general and so forth. Sounds very amorphous, but I think it's coming together. But it's kind of, it's a book that I'm hoping will run from Paul to like the, I don't know, the 500s. So it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have to figure out how to not make it 1,000 pages, but I will do that. So that's the big thing. The second thing is I'm involved in a project in which of a new series that Cambridge University Press is doing called Coptic Gospels and Associated Texts. And so I'm doing a little volume on the first full tractate, or I guess it's really the second, in Nag Hammadi Codex 1, which is called the Apocryphon of James, or we call it the Apocryphon of James. It doesn't have a title. Secret Book of James, Secret Letter of James. We all have all these titles for it. So anyway, it's a very neglected text. And so I'm going to, it will be a kind of translation and with kind of introduction and notes for, a kind of, at a kind of introductory level, but by introductory, I mean more like grad student or advanced undergrad, grad, and maybe someone in our field who's never encountered this text before. So I'm working through that as well. It's extremely mysterious. That's not the right word. It's enigmatic is what it is. So long passages where you have no idea what it's Jesus, mostly Jesus talking, what Jesus is actually saying. So yeah, anyway, so there's a big thing and a less big thing, a kind of small thing. So anyway, that's what I'm up to these days.
Sounds great. And we're looking forward to reading both of these potential books. It's gonna
someday, yes, they will come out. I'm absolutely confident that I will finish them. But there you go. I have no idea when that will be. So
working on.
I'm you know, words have been produced. So we're making progress. So that's good. Yes.
Great. So I think we'll stop here. And thank you again. Thank you so much for doing this and giving us so much insight in your career into your perspective also on the fields of patristics. And yeah, so
this has been great. It's nice to reflect on all this stuff and how grateful I really am for the community of the wider community of patristic scholars that the association represents and facilitates. So it's a great group.
Great. So thank you again, and goodbye to everybody.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
Bye.